What happens when you die? That question keeps soldiers awake at night. But what if something not from this world already knows the answer? What if it's been watching humans die for thousands of years? I wasn't searching for answers about the afterlife. I was a guard at a facility that doesn't exist. My job was simple: stand watch, follow orders. Never ask questions that weren't on the briefing sheet. The thing locked behind that glass wasn't violent, didn't scream or attack or try to escape. It just waited, calm, patient. Like time meant nothing to it. Before every shift we got the same warning: do not ask it about God. Do not ask it about death. Most people followed that rule, not because they feared punishment, but because something about those topics made the air feel heavy. And when I finally asked what happens after humans die, the room went quiet in a way I can't explain. Hey, this is Battleground Times, and before we go further, hit that subscribe button right now. You're about to hear something most people are too afraid to ask. Stories like this don't come around often. And if you enjoy military encounters that challenge everything you thought you knew, you need to be subscribed so you don't miss what's coming next. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from, because what I'm about to share might change how you think about death itself. The facility wasn't on any map. Nothing above ground made you look twice. No flags, no signs, no guard towers, just reinforced concrete half buried into empty landscape. The kind of structure you'd mistake for a storage depot. You didn't arrive there by accident. You were escorted, cleared, escorted again. Phones were surrendered before you reached the main elevator. Once those doors closed, there was no signal, no sense of direction, no way to tell how far down you were going. The descent felt wrong, too long. Your ears popped once, then again. By the time the doors opened, you realized daylight no longer mattered. Down there, everything was carved directly into solid rock. The walls weren't painted, they were sealed. Thick, uneven stone reinforced with steel panels. No insignias anywhere, no flags, no unit patches, no motivational posters. Even the clocks were missing. Time was tracked by shift rotations and nothing else. The air carried a constant hum, not loud at first, but impossible to ignore once you noticed. It came from generators, ventilation systems, and something else you couldn't identify. It wasn't unpleasant, but it made silence feel artificial. Like the place didn't want to be completely quiet. Officially, it was protocol. Unofficially, everyone knew the real reason. People didn't last long down there. Some guards reported nausea after a few shifts. Others couldn't sleep even when they went home. A few developed headaches that wouldn't stop. Nobody talked about fear because there was nothing obvious to be afraid of. But the anxiety was real. It crept in quietly. You'd notice when someone asked to swap shifts without explanation, or when a seasoned soldier suddenly requested reassignment after years of service. Medical staff logged the symptoms, but no conclusions were ever shared. The containment room was almost disappointingly plain. A rectangular chamber surrounded by thick glass, slightly tinted, soft, dim lighting that never changed. No chains, no restraints bolted to the floor. The entity inside wasn't pinned down or suspended or drugged. It stood there on its own, upright and still, as if restraint had never been necessary. There were no signs of struggle on the walls, no damage, no claw marks or impact scars. The room was clean, sterile, calm to the point of discomfort. Or you could stand there for hours and nothing would happen, and somehow that made it worse. Behind the glass was the observation area, narrow and quiet. A few chairs bolted to the floor, recording equipment mounted into the walls. When you stood there, you always felt like you were the one being examined. The entity never pressed against the glass. It never tried to get closer. It didn't follow your movements with panic or curiosity. It simply acknowledged your presence and remained where it was. Nothing about it felt hostile. What unsettled everyone was how calm it was about being there. The first time you saw it, your brain struggled to place it. It wasn't monstrous, and it wasn't impressive the way movies prepare you for. It was tall, thinner than any human should be, with long limbs that looked almost fragile, like they weren't built for strength but for endurance. Its skin had no dramatic color or texture, just a muted, uneven tone that absorbed light instead of reflecting it. There were no sharp features meant to intimidate, no obvious signs of aggression. If anything, it looked vulnerable. And that made it harder to understand why so many protocols existed just to stand in the same room with it. When it communicated, there was no clear movement of its mouth. In fact, it was hard to tell where a mouth even was at first glance. There was no vibration in the air, no sound you could trace back to a source. The words didn't arrive through your ears. They appeared fully formed in your mind, calm and measured, as if they had always been there and you were only just noticing them. Everyone who interacted with it described the same thing. The voice didn't have an accent or tone you could copy. It felt neutral, not cold, not warm, just present. What stood out most was how little it reacted to authority. Threats didn't register. Raised voices didn't change its posture. Rank, weapons, procedures meant nothing to it. It never flinched when armed guards entered the room, and it never showed relief when they left. There was no fear response to study, no anger to provoke. That absence unsettled people more than hostility ever could. Humans are used to reactions. We expect something in return. With it, there was nothing to push against. It never claimed to be God, and it never dismissed the idea of one either. When questions drifted toward belief, creation, or meaning, it treated them seriously, but without reverence or ridicule. Religion to it wasn't something to attack or exploit. It was something to be acknowledged. There was no mockery in its responses, no attempt to undermine faith. Only an unsettling clarity that suggested it understood why humans believed what they did. It didn't speak like something superior. It spoke like something older. People assumed there was a crash or a battle, some dramatic moment where everything went wrong. There wasn't. The recovery didn't involve flames, wreckage, or a panicked scramble to contain something dangerous. It was found during an underground operation, far below the surface, in a place where no human activity was supposed to exist. The team that encountered it initially thought they were dealing with a geological anomaly or an equipment malfunction. What they found instead was a chamber that didn't belong to us, and the entity was already there. There were no weapons recovered, no devices that looked like tools of war, nothing that suggested preparation for conflict. The entity wasn't hiding, and it wasn't defending itself. When the perimeter was established and containment procedures were initiated, it didn't resist, it didn't attempt to flee, it didn't challenge the soldiers or test their limits. It simply complied, as if the outcome had already been decided long before anyone set foot in that space. That detail made its way quietly through the ranks and unsettled even the most experienced personnel. During the early interviews, someone finally asked if it understood what was happening. The answer came without hesitation. It said containment was inevitable, that discovery always followed observation, and observation always ended the same way. When pressed on what it meant, it explained calmly that this had happened before. Many times, different civilizations, different eras, different outcomes. But the process was familiar to it. That was the moment when the story stopped feeling like an incident and started feeling like a pattern. No one officially acknowledged that answer. It was logged, classified, and buried in reports that most people would never read. But the idea spread quietly through the facility. This wasn't a first contact situation. It was a repeat occurrence, and whatever was happening beneath the surface wasn't new. It was simply our turn to notice it, or even though it wasn't clearly written anywhere. Questions about origin, observation, and biology were encouraged, carefully structured. But the moment conversation drifted toward death, or what comes after it, senior interrogators would redirect, without explanation. Sometimes it happened mid-sentence, as if instinct took over before protocol did. On the few occasions someone pushed closer to that boundary, equipment issues followed, in ways that became impossible to ignore. Audio recordings distorted without warning, lights flickered briefly, and biometric monitors showed sudden spikes in heart rate and stress. Among personnel who were otherwise trained to remain calm, medical staff started noticing patterns. Guards coming off those sessions reported anxiety that didn't match the content of the exchange, difficulty sleeping, and an unease that stayed with them long after they left the facility. The situation escalated quietly. One interrogator, a veteran with decades of experience and a reputation for emotional control, submitted his resignation without warning, after a session that was never entered into the official logs. When asked privately what had happened, he said very little, only that some knowledge doesn't injure the body, but it stays with you in ways that can't be undone. Not long after, a closed briefing was held to address growing concerns among staff. It wasn't a disciplinary meeting, and it wasn't reassurance either. It was a warning. The subject wasn't dangerous. The information was. If you're still watching, drop a comment below and tell me if you'd ask the same question I did. Would you want to know what happens after death, or would you follow the rule and stay silent? Let me know where you're watching from. And if this story is making you think differently, hit that share button and send this to someone who needs to hear it. Because what comes next gets even deeper. The night I asked the question, the room felt unusually still. The containment chamber looked exactly as it always did. Clean glass, dim, steady lighting, and the familiar hum in the walls. There were no observers behind me, no officers watching from another room, only the recording equipment embedded into the structure around us. I stood in the same place I always stood, at the approved distance, following the same procedures I had followed dozens of times before. There was no anger behind the question, and no attempt to provoke a reaction. It didn't come from impatience or curiosity alone. It came from the weight of everything that had been avoided for so long. When I spoke, my voice was calm and respectful. I asked plainly, "What happens to humans after they die?" There was no pause, no visible reaction. The entity didn't shift its posture or turn its attention toward me in any noticeable way. The response came immediately, fully formed, calm and certain, as if the question had been expected. As it answered, the lights in the room dimmed slightly, not enough to trigger an alarm, and not enough to be dismissed as coincidence. The hum beneath the floor deepened for a brief moment, then returned to normal. The entity remained exactly where it was, composed and still, as if this moment had always been part of the sequence, and the question itself had simply arrived on time. The response did not come with drama or warning. There was no shift in posture, no pause, no sign that the question had crossed a line. The answer arrived calmly, deliberately, as if the subject had been discussed many times before. It explained that humans are not biological accidents, not the unintended result of random processes stumbling into awareness. According to the entity, human life is intentional in structure. Even if its origin is misunderstood, consciousness, it said, does not emerge from the brain in the way modern science often assumes. The brain functions as an interface, a translator, a biological system designed to interact with the physical world. Awareness itself exists independently of it. The entity compared the human body to a vessel, not a source, and said that confusing the container for what it contains is a mistake repeated across civilizations. It continued by explaining that consciousness is not produced by matter, but temporarily bound to it. The brain shapes experience, alters perception, and limits access, but it does not generate the self. Damage the brain and consciousness expresses itself imperfectly, just as a damaged instrument produces distorted sound. Death in that sense is not annihilation, it is disengagement. When the body can no longer sustain the interface, consciousness withdraws. This withdrawal is not violent or disorienting. It follows a structure as predictable as birth, though far less understood. The entity spoke of this transition as something observed repeatedly across different species and worlds, as a consistent pattern rather than a mystery. To it, death was not a cliff, it was a threshold. When it described what continues after death, it emphasized continuity over change. Identity remains intact. Memory persists. The sense of self does not dissolve into nothingness. What falls away are the distortions imposed by physical survival. Fear. My fists is not what altered. This clarity is what humans experience as judgment, though not in the way it is often taught. There is no external tribunal, no being weighing actions on a scale. Instead, judgment is immediate self-recognition. Consciousness freed from denial and distraction perceives itself fully, every intention, every choice. Every moral compromise becomes visible without distortion. There is no escape from this awareness, not because it is enforced, but because it is complete. This explanation aligned closely with many religious teachings. Though framed differently, the separation of soul and body occurs. Moral accountability remains. The self continues. What differs is the mechanism, and it is not punitive in intent. Consciousness does not suffer because it is sentenced to suffering. It suffers when it recognizes its own misalignment. The entity explained that this recognition is not cruel, it is necessary. Without it, growth would be impossible. This is why it said moral choice matters so deeply during physical life. The conditions of uncertainty, limitation, and faith are not flaws in the system. They are the system. When asked indirectly about heaven and hell, the entity reframed them without dismissing their reality. It explained that these states are not locations defined by geography, but conditions defined by alignment. Alignment with truth, selflessness, and what humans often call God produces expansion, connection, and peace. Misalignment produces isolation, contraction, and separation. These are not emotions that pass. They are environments created by the nature of consciousness itself. Heaven and hell are not rewards or punishments imposed from outside. They are outcomes that arise naturally from what consciousness has become. The entity stressed that no soul is forced into torment for the sake of balance. Suffering emerges from resistance to alignment, just as peace emerges from acceptance of it. At this point, the entity addressed human scripture without being prompted. It acknowledged that religious texts described these realities symbolically. They were not meant to be technical manuals, but moral guides. The entity made it clear that the purpose of Scripture was not precision, but direction. Humans were not meant to understand everything fully while embodied. Certainty, it said, collapses moral choice. Faith exists because uncertainty is required for growth. If humans knew exactly what awaited them after death, the meaning of their choices would be compromised. This was where its explanation bridged belief and observation in a way that felt unsettlingly coherent. It did not deny God, nor did it define God in human terms. It described what humans experience as divine presence, as alignment with the underlying structure of consciousness itself. The entity did not worship. It observed. And what it observed confirmed that moral orientation mattered more than belief systems, institutions, or labels. It explained that humans are studied not for their technology or intelligence, but for their capacity to choose good under uncertainty. That capacity, it said, is rare. Toward the end of its response, the entity delivered a line that felt less like information and more like a conclusion. It said that humans often argue over whether faith or science holds the truth, not realizing they describe the same structure from different angles. Your scriptures describe it symbolically. We observe it structurally. That sentence settled into the room and stayed there. In that moment, it became clear that the most unsettling part of its answer was not the confirmation of an afterlife. It was the implication that humanity had been given enough information all along, just not enough certainty to avoid responsibility. Nothing about the answer felt hostile. Nothing felt dismissive. If anything, it felt patient, almost restrained. The entity did not tell us what to believe. It described what it had seen. And when it finished, it remained exactly where it was, calm and unmoved, as if the truth it had shared was not dangerous to it at all, only to us. When I asked why humans don't remember anything from before birth or after death, the entity responded without hesitation, as if the question itself had been anticipated. It explained that memory is not erased as punishment or limitation, but filtered by design. According to it, unfiltered memory would collapse the very conditions that make human life meaningful. If humans entered life with full awareness of what comes after death, moral choice would lose its weight. Fear, courage, sacrifice, faith, and hope would all become calculation, not recognition. Choice, it said, only matters when uncertainty exists. Without uncertainty, action becomes calculation. Earth, in its words, is a low-information environment by intention, not by failure. Humans are meant to live without certainty so that their decisions reveal who they truly are, not who they become when outcomes are guaranteed. It went further, explaining that faith is not a flaw in human design, but a requirement for growth. Certainty removes meaning because it removes risk. Love chosen without certainty is more valuable than obedience produced by fear or proof. The entity did not dismiss prayer, belief, or doubt. Instead, it described them as mechanisms that operate only under limited knowledge. Memory returns after death, it said, but it returns gradually, in a way that does not overwhelm consciousness. The process is measured, not sudden, allowing understanding without erasing responsibility. In that sense, forgetting is not loss. It is protection. Humans are not denied truth. They are allowed to arrive at it honestly. The explanation then shifted away from death and toward purpose, and this was where the tone changed subtly. The entity explained that humanity is observed not because it is advanced, but because it is rare. Most intelligent life, it said, does not experience moral struggle the way humans do. In many civilizations, survival pressures are minimal, social structures are fixed, and ethical decisions carry little cost. Humanity, by contrast, exists under constant tension. Humans must choose between self-interest and sacrifice, comfort and responsibility, fear and conviction, not interfered with. The entity made it clear that observation does not mean guidance. Humans are not directed, corrected, or protected from consequence. Intervention would invalidate the very thing being observed. Growth only occurs when choice is genuine. That is why contact is limited, fragmented, and indirect. Humanity is not studied for its technology or intelligence. Those develop naturally across many civilizations. Humans are studied for their choices, for how they behave when no one is watching, for what they do when belief must exist without proof. That, it said, is what makes humanity significant. The statement hung in the air like a verdict, not celebrating humanity, not diminishing it, just recognizing what made us different from everything else they had encountered. I stood there processing what had just been explained, and the weight of it settled differently than I expected. It wasn't fear. It wasn't awe. It was responsibility. The entity wasn't telling us we were special in a way that elevated us above others. It was explaining that we were being tested in a way most intelligent life never experiences. The uncertainty we live with, the doubt we carry, the faith we struggle to maintain, those weren't accidents. They were conditions, deliberately maintained, because only under those conditions could our true nature be revealed. The recording equipment continued its steady hum. The lights remained dim and constant. The entity stood exactly where it had stood since the beginning. Nothing had changed in the physical space, but everything had changed in how I understood it. Before we continue, I want to ask you something. Has this story changed the way you think about your own choices? About what happens after? Drop a comment and let me know. And if you haven't subscribed to Battleground Times yet, do it now. Because stories like this don't show up in your feed by accident. You need to be subscribed to catch the next one. Share this with someone who's been asking the same questions, because what comes next gets even more direct. The question about the Bible was asked carefully, without challenge or expectation. Is the Bible true? The entity did not answer immediately, but when it did, the response was measured and precise. It said that the core truths contained within Scripture are preserved, though imperfectly expressed. Human language, culture, and history shaped how those truths were recorded, and interpretation introduced division where guidance was intended. The message, it explained, was never meant to serve institutions more than individuals. The purpose of Scripture was not control, but orientation, not dominance, but direction. It did not deny God, and it did not diminish the importance of faith. It spoke of them with seriousness, not distance. It explained that humans often confuse the message with the structure built around it. Institutions evolve, interpretations fracture, but the central call toward humility, responsibility, love, and moral accountability remains intact. The entity did not validate atheism, nor did it elevate belief systems above one another. It stated only that truth does not belong to institutions. It belongs to alignment, and alignment is revealed through action, not labels. That distinction mattered, because it meant that what you called yourself, what building you attended, what denomination you claimed, none of that determined your standing after death. What mattered was what you did, how you treated others, the choices you made when no one was looking. The entity was clear on this point. Belief without action is hollow, and action aligned with truth matters regardless of what religious label accompanies it. This was not an attack on religion, it was a clarification. The entity respected the role of faith. It acknowledged the power of Scripture, but it separated the tool from the outcome. Scripture was given to guide, not to replace personal responsibility, to direct moral development, not to serve as a tribal marker that divided the worthy from the unworthy. When I asked if people of different faiths, or even no faith at all, could still experience what religious people call salvation, the entity's response was immediate. It said alignment transcends terminology. A person who lives with humility, compassion, and moral courage aligns with truth regardless of the name they give it. Conversely, a person who uses religious language while acting in cruelty, selfishness, or hatred misaligns regardless of their claimed belief. The judgment that follows death is not about which scripture you followed. It is about whether your consciousness aligned with truth, love, and selflessness. or whether it aligned with deception, hate, and ego. The entity explained that many humans waste their lives arguing over whose interpretation is correct, while missing the entire point of why the guidance was given. The message was never tribal, it was universal, and the failure to recognize that universality is itself a form of misalignment. This part of the conversation felt heavier than the rest, because it meant that certainty about doctrine, pride in religious affiliation, or confidence in being part of the right group meant nothing if your actions contradicted the principles those groups claimed to teach. The entity didn't say religion was false. It said religion was often misunderstood, used incorrectly, turned into a weapon or a shield instead of a tool for growth. And that misuse, it explained, creates suffering both in life and after it. Near the end of the session, the entity stated something that changed the atmosphere in the room. It said, "Humanity is approaching a threshold, not technological, but moral. Innovation," it explained, "has outpaced wisdom. Power has increased faster than responsibility. The conditions that justify observation are not permanent. Observation is temporary by nature. It exists only while uncertainty remains meaningful. When moral choice becomes compromised by knowledge, manipulation, or control, the purpose of observation ends. Only that participation replaces observation when thresholds are crossed. That line stayed with everyone who heard it. When observation ends, participation begins. Whether that participation is constructive or corrective was not explained. The entity did not frame it as threat or promise. It presented it as consequence, neutral, inevitable. I asked what it meant by participation. The entity paused for the first time since the conversation began. Not long, just a hesitation that felt deliberate. Then it explained that observation allows civilizations to develop authentically, without interference, without external correction. But when a civilization reaches a point where its choices begin to affect structures beyond its own world, observation is no longer appropriate. At that point, other civilizations must respond. The response, it said, depends entirely on the nature of the choices being made. A civilization that crosses the threshold with wisdom, humility, and moral maturity is welcomed, integrated, supported. A civilization that crosses the threshold with arrogance, violence, and disregard for consequence is contained, corrected, or, if necessary, prevented from spreading further. The entity made it clear that humanity is currently approaching that line, not because of our weapons, not because of our technology, but because of how we use them, and more importantly, how we treat each other. The choices we make in the next few generations will determine whether participation is collaborative or corrective. It said this without emotion, without judgment, just as a fact. Like describing weather patterns or geological shifts, the outcome, it explained, is entirely in human hands. But the threshold is real, and it is close. I asked if humanity could still change course. The entity said yes, immediately, without hesitation. It explained that no outcome is fixed until the choice is made. Humanity still operates in a state of uncertainty, which means every decision still matters, every act of kindness, every moment of courage, every choice to act with integrity instead of convenience. All of it contributes to the direction of the whole. The entity stressed that individuals often underestimate their influence. They assume that because they are not leaders, not famous, not powerful, their choices don't matter. But that assumption is false. It influences others, it shifts cultures, and cultures determine the trajectory of civilizations. One person cannot change the whole, but one person can influence 10. Those 10 can influence 100. And patterns emerge. Because the outcome is not yet determined, humanity still has the capacity to choose wisely, but that capacity is not unlimited. And time is not infinite. Before you go further, let me ask you this. What are you going to do differently after hearing this? Are you going to change the way you treat people? The way you make decisions when no one's watching? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if this story is hitting you the way it hit me, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to Battleground Times so you don't miss the final part. Because what I'm about to tell you next is the reason I was reassigned, and the reason these recordings were buried. The interrogation ended quietly. No alarms. No confrontation. The entity returned to its usual stillness, standing in the exact center of the containment chamber, as if nothing significant had been discussed. But I knew better, and so did everyone who would eventually review those recordings. The air in the observation room felt different, heavier, like the space itself had absorbed the weight of what had been said. I stood there for a moment longer, looking through the glass at a being that had just explained the structure of life, death, and everything that follows, and it looked back at me, not with eyes exactly, but with presence, acknowledgement, as if it knew exactly what burden I was now carrying. The recording equipment continued its steady operation, red lights blinking in rhythm, capturing every word, every pause, every moment of that exchange. Within hours, those recordings would be sealed, classified under layers of clearance I didn't have access to, locked away where most people would never know they existed. I was reassigned without explanation, transferred to a role that had nothing to do with observation or containment. Routine, forgettable, the kind of position you give someone when you want them far away from something but can't afford to discharge them entirely. No one asked me questions afterward. No one debriefed me. There was no exit interview, no psychological evaluation, just new orders, a new location, and complete silence about everything that had happened in that facility. The silence was the loudest part. In the military, you get used to debriefings, after-action reports, procedures designed to process what you've experienced. But there was none of that. Just reassignment, and the clear, unspoken message that I was never to speak about what I had heard. That more than anything told me the weight of what had been said. The entity's words weren't just classified. They were buried, hidden, kept from the public not because they were dangerous in a physical sense, but because they were dangerous to systems, to institutions, to the carefully maintained structures of belief and control that govern human society. Sleep became difficult after that, not because of fear, but because of clarity. Certain questions no longer felt abstract. Death stopped feeling distant. It wasn't some far-off event that happened to other people. It was a threshold, a transition, something that waited for everyone. And now I knew, or at least believed I knew, what came next. That knowledge changed things. Joy stopped feeling small. Moments with family, conversations with friends, acts of kindness from strangers. All of it took on different weight. Because if what the entity said was true, if consciousness continues and judgment is self-recognition, then everything mattered. Not in some vague philosophical way, but in a direct, structural, unavoidable way. Every choice, every word, every moment of integrity or compromise, all of it was being recorded, not by some external judge, but by consciousness itself. The world didn't change, but the way I moved through it did. I found myself more patient, more deliberate, more aware of the gap between what I wanted to do and what I should do. The entity had explained that this gap, this tension between self-interest and moral action, was exactly what made humanity rare, what made us worth observing, and now I couldn't unknow that. I couldn't pretend my choices didn't matter. Some nights I still hear the hum of that facility in my head, steady and constant, like something still running beneath the surface. But a presence I feel, a reminder that somewhere deep underground, that entity is still there, still waiting, still observing, and maybe still answering questions to people who are willing to ask. I don't know if what it said was the full truth. I don't have proof. I don't have verification from multiple sources. I just have what I heard, what I experienced, and the way it changed me. I don't know if humanity understands even half of what it is part of. The entity suggested we don't, that we're operating with limited information by design, that the uncertainty we live with is intentional, necessary, part of the structure that makes moral choice meaningful. But I do know this. Whatever happens after we die, we are not unprepared. We've been given guidance, through scripture, through conscience, through the internal sense of right and wrong that exists even when no one is watching. The entity confirmed what many religious traditions have taught for thousands of years, that the soul continues, that judgment occurs, that alignment with truth matters. It just explained the mechanism differently, stripped away the cultural imagery, and described what it had observed across multiple civilizations and worlds. And in doing so, it made something ancient feel suddenly immediate. The entity also made it clear that we are not alone in this, that humanity is being watched, not by a single god in the way many imagine, but by intelligences that have observed this process countless times, that understand what we're going through because they've seen it before. In other species, other worlds, other epochs of time, we are not the first to face these questions. But we are currently at a point in our development where the questions matter more than ever, because we are approaching a threshold. We have advanced technologically while regressing ethically in some areas. And that imbalance, according to the entity, is what determines whether observation continues or whether something else begins. I think about that often. What participation might look like, whether it would be welcomed or feared, whether humanity would rise to the challenge or collapse under the weight of it. The entity said the outcome is not fixed, that we still have time, that individual choices still matter. But it also said the threshold is close. And I believe it, not because I want to, but because I see the evidence everywhere, in how we treat each other, in how we respond to crisis, in the gap between our capacity for good and our tendency toward selfishness. We are capable of incredible compassion and incredible cruelty, often in the same day, by the same people. The entity understood that about us. It didn't judge us for it, but it observed it, and it knew that the direction we ultimately choose will determine what comes next, not just for individuals, but for the species. If you've stayed with this story until the end, thank you for watching. And thank you for taking the time to sit with questions most people avoid. Stories like this aren't meant to give easy answers. They're meant to make us think, and maybe look a little more closely at the choices we make while we're here. If you enjoy carefully told accounts that explore military encounters, unexplained events, and the deeper questions surrounding human existence, make sure you're subscribed to Battleground Times. New stories like this are uploaded regularly, and subscribing helps ensure you don't miss the next one. Before you go, I really want to know something. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and what part of this story stayed with you the most. Your perspective matters. And these conversations are often as interesting as the stories themselves. If this made you think differently about what comes next, share it with someone who needs to hear it, because the truth isn't meant to stay locked away. It's meant to be discussed, questioned, and understood. The entity told me that humanity has been given enough information to make the right choices. We just haven't been given enough certainty to avoid responsibility. That means it's on us, every single one of us, to decide what kind of civilization we become, what kind of threshold we cross, and what kind of participation we invite. Thanks for watching Battleground Times. And remember, the choices you make today matter more than you think. They matter after you're gone, and they matter to whatever is watching us right now. Make them count.